So first two groups we talked about were working groups. We tend to also do a third conversation on these calls that probably isn't going to turn into a dedicated working group. We put the Slack link up there for the other working group because this is really a part of that. You know, how do you start to reduce waste? This conversation came out of like a lot of these Slack. There was a conversation, I think this was in the AWS room where, gosh, who was it? It was Andrew Sledge from Cox posted a Cloudflare article about what was termed egregious data egress charges by one of the cloud providers. And I actually really liked, in the spirit of, you know, be respectful, share best practices, the conversation went from this, hey, let's get angry at X and Y, you know, cloud providers about their data egress, to actually be like an interesting conversation about data transfer, how it is something that requires special types of planning, how it's hard to forecast, and particularly for streaming companies, how it's such a critical part of their FinOps process, both in terms of scale and that it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, right? More streaming, more data transfer, et cetera. So bring in a few of the folks that you met earlier, and I think one or two new ones to share a little bit about this. Vaz is gonna help moderate this. Vaz, anything else you saw that was interesting in the Slack conversation, or the points you're curious to hear from these folks as we get into the conversation?
Yeah, so JR, thanks for kind of teeing everything up there. I think, you know, generally speaking, getting a handle on data transfer, ingress and egress traffic flows is challenging enough, but now consider the additional layer of complexity, having to account and attribute those costs back to the business. I think this panel is going to have some great thoughts for us to share. And other than what you've already mentioned, I would say, you know, some of the questions we're hoping to tackle with the discussion in this segment is, you know, how do you effectively manage your data transfer spending? How do you find opportunities for optimization? I know there was a post earlier by Alex Hulla. Thanks for that post, Alex, in the members call Slack channel. And then how do you deal with hybrid environments? So, you know, if you still have some on-prem infrastructure as well as you're migrating to the cloud, what considerations do you need to take for managing data transfer costs? So maybe we can kickstart the panel discussion by, you mentioned a lot of the folks that we've already met them, but maybe we can kickstart the panel discussion off by meeting one of our panelists, Teresa from EA. Teresa, if you're on, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yep, hi, I'm here. Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa. I'm the go-to technical to financial translator for electronic arts. Gaming and FinOps has been my passion for the last 13 years, and supporting the creation of great video games and translating the technical requirements to support our online players into financial data is where I focused my attention for the last 8 of those 13 years. Maybe you've heard of one of our new releasing games this year, Battlefield 2042. I'm currently in the process of modeling all of our infrastructure spend, data transfer included, for this title in the run-up to launch in October. I also did that modeling for Need for Speed Heat and for Battlefront 2. And Battlefront 2 is actually where we're going to talk about today. My work on this title is our data transfer story. So if you can go to the next slide. All right, so almost 5 years ago, we came up with this great solution to reducing our on-prem costs and moving all of our gaming servers for Battlefront 2 to cloud. But what we didn't take into consideration was that data transfer was not included in the costs of moving to cloud. Data transfer is an a la carte offering for our cloud providers. When you operate on on-prem servers, as most of you know, data transfer is just a built-in cost of either the server costs or the space costs, depending on whether you're leasing or if you own those servers. And with that, data transfer is included. When you migrate to a cloud solution, data transfer becomes that a la carte cost that you have to think about. When we started running the cost model for the Battlefront 2 on cloud, we didn't know how to look at data transfer, and we almost solely looked at what the savings on just moving compute was. And then we got our first bill And it was way above what we expected to be getting charged for that. And that was the data transfer because we didn't include it into our modeling. Can we hit the next slide? So what did we do? So the first thing that we did is we started asking questions, and there was no question that we would consider stupid. We asked the game team what the drivers of that cost were. We asked the game team what the benefits were. We partnered with them to figure out if what they were doing with their data transfer was in line with their expectations, while also making sure that they knew that we did not inherently consider data transfer a bad cost. Fact, games talk. They talk out, they talk in. They are chatty. The question that we needed to answer was if it was chatty for the right reasons. Games send out data to players for just about everything. And that data, was that data being sent out at the right times and at the right size? And then we get data transfer in from those players. What are they engaging in? What choices are they making? What decisions are they making about the game? Eventually, it became this really interesting feedback loop. We would send out data, we'd get data back, we'd associate that data with not only our revenue, but our engagement from our players. And then we'd make a decision. Do we need to change that, that data? Do we need to make it bigger, smaller, less frequent, more frequent? And then we'd repeat the cycle. You send it out again, you get data back, you make new decisions. Now we have a method to not only model and forecast data transfer, we also have assumptions that we can use to compare to actual usage when it doesn't match our forecast. All right, next slide. So what did we learn? Data transfer in our case is a required cost. It is not inherently good. It is not inherently bad. It's just required. Next, you can negotiate anything. It doesn't hurt to ask to, for lower pricing. The worst someone is going to do is tell you no. And then you're not any worse off than you were when you started. Forecasting is always wrong. You can't control all of the cost drivers, but you can make them less wrong. And last but not least, and where we get into a lot of trouble, is if you don't manage and have clear oversight of your data transfer, you can get a whopper of a bill later on, and it gets way out of hand.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Teresa.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's super helpful stuff. And I have a couple follow-up questions for you, but before we jump in, I also want to take a moment and have Scott Meyer really quickly introduce himself. And Scott, maybe after you introduce yourself, if you're open to talking about how data transfer, how you're dealing with data transfer costs, containerization, and how containerization has impacted your costs.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Meyer. I work for Spotify, and I work with for Anders, and focused on our cost optimization for cloud. And yeah, as a streaming company, we certainly have a lot of network costs. At the same time, we are, we're fully cloud native, so we don't have the issues of being, having on-prem and in the cloud. But I want to talk a little bit about kind of some things we ran into with like Kubernetes networking, and how we were so surprised by our network costs. So do I have time for a story, or are we how are we on the panel?
Yeah, we're going to take about 15 minutes total for the panel here. So if you can take maybe a minute or two for a story.
Okay, yeah, I'll do like a 2-minute story on kind of what we experienced. So we ran into a cost incident with Kubernetes networking, and we have good ways of allocating our compute. So our CPU and RAM, we're able to meter that data, bring it across different namespaces, making a lot of sense that way. But we did not have the same with networking. So we had a lot of network costs attributed to one large Kubernetes project as a multi-tenant cluster, but we didn't have a way of doing it with network. So what we did is we actually built some VPC flow log sampling and having labeling injected into that. And then from that, we were able to actually allocate our Kubernetes network costs. And, you know, some of the solutions we came up with were to actually introduce compression in certain areas. So we had some ML jobs that were huge and had really, really heavy payloads. So once we had those flow log sampling, we were able to say, okay, these are the ones consuming a lot of space and network costs. And then, you know, in some cases, adding compression added like 80 or 90% reduction in costs in the short-term solution. But then our long-term solution is to have better zone-aware network routing. So we can have, you know, if you're in like US Central or, you know, US East 1 Zone A, you can, within that region, you can then talk to another service in Zone A. And we were spending a ton of money, you know, going from like Zone A to Zone B within the same region. So we were able to kind of identify that and solve that through, you know, better zone aware network routing, which in some cases you'd call it like application routing and that kind of thing. So I think that covers most of it, but yeah, it was something that caught us by surprise and we weren't able to properly allocate it. But then once we were able to allocate it, then it made a lot more sense. Who was kind of 80-20 rule, you know, with everything, who was actually consuming that, and then having the compression and, you know, eventually having zone aware routing is, you know, going to be a huge cost saver for us in the future once we fully roll that out.
Thanks a lot, Scott. A couple things, right? Number one, we always love stories here at the FinOps Foundation, and that was a great story. And number two, thanks for sharing sort of your strategy for how you're tackling data transfer costs and containers. I know a lot of folks, you know, just as they're getting a handle on more traditional infrastructure and allocating costs and building out chargeback models, you introduce the complexity and lack of visibility of containers and trying to get sort of similar you know, visibility into that data, and your strategy that you just described sounds really interesting. For folks on the call who want to talk a little bit more with Scott, we are going to be doing a breakout room related to data transfer, so stay tuned. You can join that conversation. Having said that, I did want to circle back to Teresa. And Teresa, if you are got your finger on the mute button handy, you had mentioned just as you were wrapping up your discussion around getting a handle on sort of and visibility into data transfer costs. And if you don't, they get out of hand really fast. You know what, it reminded me of a conversation we had a couple of weeks back where you were talking about making decisions around being okay with some costs. Can you talk to us about that, as it, for example, if I recall correctly, relates to user experience?
Yeah, so in our case, specifically in gaming, and probably across a lot of, you know, other media groups like Netflix or other streaming groups, there's a cost to player engagement and player sentiment. And it's all about making sure that you're spending money in the right places, but never jeopardizing your engagement from your end user. And in our case, data transfer is a huge part of that. Without being able to send and collect data, we can't make informed decisions that will increase player engagement or increase player sentiment. So knowing that there is cost that is just the cost of doing business, and doing business well is something to keep in mind. So we don't label something inherently bad or inherently good. It's just a cost of doing business.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for that. And
yeah.
I have a quick follow-up for you as well, kind of touching on the earlier part of your discussion around your experiences at EA. If you had to give us maybe one or two examples, sort of under the label of "if I knew then what I know now," you know, how has managing data transfer costs changed from what you originally were planning to do?
So when we started using cloud providers, we were adamant that the only way to manage data transfer and attribute it to the right end user was that we had to have single tenants in each account. So every game, every service, every application, we had to stand up a single new account for them. And then we would just attribute everything in that account to that end user. in the last 5 years, we've certainly matured in that world where we are now allowing and really encouraging the idea of multi-tenancy, where you can set up the baseline requirements for infrastructure for many games, many services, many applications, and it saves costs that way. But by doing so, we had to come up with a way to tag and attribute the data transfer as well as the compute to the right end user. So that Battlefront 2 account that we stood up was a single tenant account when we stood it up. And now there's over 7 games that are using that same account. And we're working with the studio who has managed to make it so that the data transfer inherits the tagging from the compute instance that is generating it. And we're using that now to allocate our cost for data transfer to the right users and overall reduce our waste. So they really do go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'll tell you, I'm really loving this discussion. So I'm really smart thinking around how to deal with a slippery topic like data transfer costs and kind of go beyond the traditional allocation and strategies for dealing with it. And sort of speaking of complications, is a good segue maybe to bring back Andy, who you all heard from earlier. Andy, you mind touching a little bit about sort of your experiences and how you're dealing with data transfer costs from a hybrid cloud scenario or perspective? I believe you were talking when we were last chatted about colo and cloud and the considerations there.
Yep. So what we're doing in Citrix with a number of our data heavy products is we're actually not using the cloud. We're using colos. So we're having colo providers who specialize in the data transfer areas, and we've undertaken studies into it. The colos are 10 times more expensive for their compute cost, but they're 100 times cheaper for their data transfers. So what we're looking at is those products that we have that are data transfer heavy, and it's transferring outside of the zones. We're using colos. We've had the discussions with the cloud providers. None of them can match that sort of element, but we have had, and coming back to Scott's, where it's sort of within the region and you're doing data transfer within the region, and talking about Teresa's negotiation, by talking to one of the cloud providers, we've got to the situation where they're actually investigating whether they would, whether they can offer data transfer within a region as a free offering. So that's something else that we're considering going forwards. But colos is the way we go because it works out most economical for us on that point.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for sharing that. And I'd like to round out the discussion by inviting Anders back in. You all heard from him earlier. He introduced himself. Anders, before I ask you your question, I just want to take a moment. Earlier, you sent out an invitation for folks who want to learn how to run 100 miles. I would like to decline that invitation. But I'm happy to take you for beers. If I remember correctly, there's a couple of nice pubs near the Spotify offices in Stockholm. So having said that, can you talk to us a little bit about your perspective on current data transfer pricing models? I know you have some opinions there, and there was some good conversation in the Slack channel as well.
Well, first, beers are actually quite a good recovery beverage after a long run. So that's not a bad idea. I'm happy to take you out whenever you come to Stockholm. So putting on my procurement manager hat here, I'd like to shine some on the original sort of intro story to this, which was the egress cost post by Cloudflare. You need to recall that they have some motivation in publishing that post. They are a vendor themselves. They are also charging for stock versus paying from flow and making a buck or two while doing this. And margins is, of course, something that a procurement specialist have a problem stomaching, particularly at this level. Why is this happening? Well, buyers have no or limited choice and options. So there's a really strong architectural lock in here. And this like makes it a less of a fair and sustainable marketplace likely. In other industry verticals, there's been the similar situation, but it no longer is there. For example, why do we no longer pay for fees when we trade stock online with online brokers? We used to do that up until not that many years ago, actually. And then someone went ahead in a race towards zero on that. I believe it was like JP Morgan Chase or something in the US and so forth, but it's the same over here in Europe right now. So it's no longer that situation. Some sort of event triggered or someone went ahead and it started resolving itself over time. Same thing has actually happened a little bit in the construction industry, which I spent 10 years in, where like 30% of the cost of the construction project is actually logistics, but it's sort of hidden away from the customer. And it's complexity you don't want to deal with really as a service customer. But once the prices go up a lot and it's outside your control and direct visibility, you get a little bit upset. So there appears to be a lack of transparency here. How do cloud providers really back up their price for these kind of services? So I think we should be thankful for Cloud for opening up that discussion. A lot of people have chimed in on Hacker News and other places talking about this. Something me and my colleagues discussed was like the CDN market behaves a little bit differently. It also gives Spotify users a better experience. So we don't really use the public cloud native CDNs. We use other like standalone CDNs, and there's competition there. So we don't get that lock-in. So that's a little bit interesting. Will we have to ask for regulations? I think the battle in the alliance is not really a regulatory thing. It's more of a cartel. I hope not, because regulation tends to be outpaced by tech, and then they become blockers to innovation. So we won't be happy for that if we ask for regulations here. Will customer have to gang up on the vendors? I hope not, especially not in this forum, because that decreases trust and innovation as well. So, but cartels aren't good for any market in the long run. So we need to get out of it somehow. And I'm curious on the solutions to this. I think like one vendor going ahead, like JP Morgan's did in online stock trading, might be the trigger that we need. Another category vendor could also re-architect the value chain a little bit, perhaps, and run like data lake somewhere else, but some stuff needs to change. And I'm really curious on other options here. Like what do you guys see here? I don't see a resolution in the near term, but within 1 or 2 or 3 years, there will definitely be a resolution. So that's the procurement specialist perspective on this.
Thanks, Anders. And as usual, always taking the conversation to the next level. So far, we've had a good conversation around challenges, some strategies for advanced cost allocation, some of the challenges if you're in a hybrid cloud situation. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing their thoughts. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we'll be doing a breakout session, but also please don't forget, there's lots of good conversation happening in the FinOps Slack. Please have your voices heard, come in there, talk with folks, ask questions, increase that tribal knowledge, and it'll benefit the community. And hopefully, to Anders' point, help us nudge forward to making things better around things that lack transparency and help us all run cloud more efficiently.